Hello everyone, I just want to go through quickly a little bit about some of the terms that we need to get comfortable with in the class. So these are terms that mostly relate to Canada. We need to remember that these terms are ever-changing. So when we take a look at different terms in Indigenous studies, they're terms that people use to self-identify. They're never set in stone. Different people will use different terms. They vary based on the individual. They also vary depending on the change in time. So for example, in the 1970s, the term Indian, which still exists in Canada because of a legislation called the Indian Act, was a common term, and now that is a term that we do not use unless an Indigenous person chooses to use that term. But amazingly, it is still codified in Canadian law. So that's a little bit racist. So we need to keep in mind that these terms change. So these are the ones we're using now, or terms that you might hear. So I have taken a quotation from a website from UBC that talks about the idea that Indigenous people identify within a particular family or a clan or a band or a nation. They tend to identify with the land they come from, but they talk often about their genealogy or their geographic location, that sort of thing. We can't always know that, but I want you to start to notice that when an Indigenous person introduces himself or herself, they will usually say the nation that they're from, and maybe they might say the clan that they're from. So you'll start to notice that, and maybe you didn't realize what was happening before, but now you'll see that. However, it's hard unless you know someone individually to know those details. So sometimes we have to use more general terms. So the word Indigenous is a global term for people who are original to a geographic location. That's the term that is most common now and the one that I will use. Aboriginal is a term that we use in the land we call Canada. It's being used less and less. And I'll tell you why that is true. Because Aboriginal people are questioning the root of the word, because Aboriginal people are original. However, ab is a prefix like abnormal that seems to modify the word original. So it is being used less and less and less. So the term native is an older term that was commonly used 10 years ago or so. This is still a Native Studies class, but that's going to be changing with the new curriculum. So it's an older term that talks about people who are original to a geographic location, and it's one we use in Canada. It's not commonly used anymore, but some Indigenous people still self-identify as Native, so you may hear them use that term. Native American is still used in the US. So it's a term that pops up all the time, but we are replacing it in Canada with Indigenous. First Nations. Now, this is an umbrella term for all of the people who are original to this country we call Canada. And it's an important term, although it's not really codified in the law anywhere. And you don't hear it used very much, but I think it's important to know because it indicates that there were a large number of nations, plural, in Canada before first contact. And that these nations existed as nations, and so they deserve recognition and sovereignty. It wasn't just a random group of people that French settlers like my family found here. They were actual nations. So it's an important, when we talk about the importance of language, this is important. Métis is a specific term for people who are descendant of a parent who was a French or English settler way back in the day, and an Indigenous person. And many have ancestral connections to the Red River settlement, which is the area where the resistance led by Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont took place. And there'll be some time to explore that a little bit. But that is not the only way you can be Métis, but you can't just call yourself Métis. There are sort of the Métis community has kind of specific ways that they identify, but they are a distinct group that's recognized now in Canada, even by legislation. The term Inuit, sometimes Inuit, although I don't hear it that often. But Inuit is a term for the people who originated in the far north of the country we call Canada. Now there are many Inuit people throughout Canada, but this is the term for the group that originated in the far north, and they keep the term Inuit, obviously. Anishinaabe, it is self-chosen. That's what term for a culturally related group of Indigenous people in Canada in the United States that include the Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Oji-Cree, Mississaugas, Chippewas, and Algonquin people. So those are all of the words in history that we know that make up the Anishinaabe people. And the term itself means the original peoples or the peoples who were put here. And that is a term that you will hear people from the Anishinaabe nations use to describe themselves. Another term you might hear is Haudenosaunee, and they are known as the Six Nations now, and they comprised of the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora peoples. First contact is a term we use for that moment when settlers came back in the 1600s and landed on North America and met Indigenous people. So that is now termed first contact. A settler Canadian, that's me and many of you, is a term for all of the inhabitants of the land we call Canada who are not Indigenous. So my family is originally settler Canadians because the Cotes came in 1630, I think. But my friend and co-worker here, her parents came originally from Italy, so she's a first-generation settler Canadian because she is also a settler. So anyone who is not Indigenous is a settler. And then, just again, don't forget that the terms we use have to be guided by Indigenous people. We have to keep in mind the idea of the respect for their culture, a sensitivity to changing terms, and then led by Indigenous people. So you might take this course in 2 years from now. There might very well be a different set of terms that are commonly used. And I heard a very interesting story about these changing terms, because when dominant culture picks a term they're comfortable with, like Native or Aboriginal or Indigenous, it tends to become colonialized and part of the kind of system of power and oppression that Indigenous people feel. So very often that term falls out of favor because as dominant society settler Canadians, we sometimes tend to hold on to a term too tightly. And with that comes all of the kind of baggage that we're going to talk about that Indigenous people face. So just keep that in mind. And I hope this is helpful and you'll get more used to these terms as we go along.